And today's presentation, as you can see on the screen, about schools, a look back at schools in Georgetown. And I'm sure that goes way back to when all of us in all these towns were part of Georgetown, and then more toward the present. And the two primary speakers are Ginny Hopcroft and Jeanne McGowan, but I understand Jeanne Reynolds is going to give some concluding comments of a story of his going to school in Georgetown. So we'll start off with Ginny.
Yes. I want to thank you all for coming out on this very snowy, messy morning. I'm sure all of you had to clean up before you came, so thanks very much for coming. As you can see, it's a look back at Georgetown's many schools and what they teach us now. We actually begin, we would have liked to have talked about all of the towns that were part of Georgetown in the early years, but the school records are pretty thin up until around the early 1800s. So we mention Arousik because they didn't separate from Georgetown until 1841. But basically, this is going to focus mostly on the current Georgetown. And now Jeanne will give you a few comments.
I guess I have to point it in the right direction. Okay, let's see. First, a commercial break. And that is that, excuse me, we're having a birthday party this year, and you're all invited. And especially you're all invited because, as Ginny just alluded, Arousik, Bath, Phippsburg, West Bath, and Woolwich were all Georgetown back at the very beginning in 1716 or thereabouts. And so there will be a number of activities. There's a town tricentennial committee making all kinds of plans, and including Georgetown Historical, who is participating in the process. There'll be lots of things going on through the spring and summer. GHS has been asked to host the official birthday party, and that will be on Sunday, June 12th. And I'm sure you'll hear more about it, but consider this your invitation to participate in the activities this coming year. I'm sure all of you recognize this island, and it probably isn't something you need to hear a lot about, except that we thought it would be useful to have you look at the island in terms of how development, how growth might have occurred in Georgetown, and in particular the schools, as well as other infrastructure such as post office and those kinds of things. But when you think about an island, as we are, as you know, of course you've got all of these nooks and crannies and inlets and so forth. And as Jeanne Reynolds often says, and says in his book, Arcadia book, the rivers were the roads. And so as Georgetown developed, we have to keep in mind that people were coming by water, and even if you're on the island, you might be coming by water, because in addition to the rivers is Robin Hood Cove, which has breaks into two branches and almost bisects the island itself, and some say back a few centuries ago it actually did. And to further explain the geography and topography of Georgetown, we use this image, which explains a little bit about how many villages and sections of town there are, not just were, but still are in Georgetown. And as in the case of many coastal communities, villages grew where there was the best access by water, and even more so on an island.
So, in relation to this geography and the different villages that arose, turns out that the schools were organized by district, and this actually was very appropriate for Georgetown because of the geography you've just heard about, but it also was that Georgetown was originally complied with a 1789 Massachusetts law requiring towns to establish school districts within the town within the towns, and that law also required that the schools teach morals and that the towns themselves finance the schools and issue teacher qualifications certificates so that the towns were responsible for getting good teachers. Although at the time there wasn't much about proficiency of the teacher, it was someone of good character and good morals. And Maine's first school law, as all of you know, Maine was not a state until 1820. Maine's first school law continued this district system, but additionally required towns to raise at least 40 cents per capita to fund the schools. So initially, it was totally funded by the individual communities. The districts received the funds based on the district's number of school-aged children, and that was decreed to be aged 4 to 21 years of age. This number holds true throughout the 19th century, throughout all of the 1800s, and indeed many classes had that range of age in the schools. District residents, within the districts, even the districts had some autonomy because they had to raise their own financial autonomy. They had to raise their own funds for repair, building, purchasing, or removing schoolhouses. And each district had an agent who reported to the school district's expenditures to the town officers. Because for the actual teacher and other school expenses, the town did give the districts money. State funds for local schools began to be provided about a decade later, initially through sale of some public lands and later under a bank tax. And then all sorts of different kinds of funding happened in the 19th century, but that's a little outside the range of the talk. So, Jeanne?
So how many school districts were there in Georgetown? According to Billy Todd, who did some tremendous research during her many years of involvement with the Historical Society, there were 10 districts as early as 1821, and that's based on some town records from the 1820s showing that there were orders for teaching and orders for boarding, meaning paying to board teachers who were staying in Georgetown, those who were from away. She further reports that the districts were listed as below, but unfortunately without any identification of physically where they were. But there was the Upper District, which was on Arousic, which of course was still part of Georgetown, or should we say Parker's Island was still part of their Georgetown at that time. The Upper District on Parker's Island, which we speculate might have been Robin Hood. Then there was, and how not helpful is this, the Middle District, the Lower District, the Eastern District, the New District. I love that one in particular, the New District. And up to a number of 10 districts in 1821, which is only marginally helpful. So the question is, which districts or schools might these be?
So it may well have included the Back River School, which sat partway between West Georgetown and Martown. The school was closed in 1906, and the building at that time was moved to Georgetown Center to be part of a house on Harrington Hill. But there are some hints in some of the old records that there was a school over in this area at the time of statehood. So that's one school we know is there. List also included the Lower Stone Schoolhouse, which we now refer to as the Bay Point Stone Schoolhouse, but it was also called the South School or Down Island School, as it was later known, which was built in 1820. One wonderful story we know about this building, the building was supervised by General Joseph Barry, and the actual builders, the actual workers, were Irish immigrants. And so it looks much like an Irish cottage. One of the interesting factors is that there's no window on that left side there near the road. That was purposely done so that the scholars, that is the word used, the scholars would not be distracted by carriages going by. So,
and that's Bay Point Road, for those of you who may not know what that location exactly is. That woman is standing in Bay Point Road, or what would be.
Also, a 1987 Tide article suggests that the Robin Hood brick schoolhouse may have been standing by 1841, but the source isn't listed, so we're not 100% sure of this. The article also notes that there was an earlier school in Riggsville prior to this building, which stopped being a school in 1929. Didn't include the Robin Hood Free Meeting House, which was built in 1855, so that's later. But this was used as a school during the period when Georgetown had a free high school, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later. It also didn't include the stone schoolhouse near Reed State Park on the Seguinland Road, which was built in 1852. And it also didn't include, because it was built much later, the school in Five Islands that now serves as a second location for the fire department. But this was used for a couple of decades during the early 20th century, and many people, you'll see a photograph of a class there that you may recognize some people in. It also wasn't the red brick schoolhouse, which is now the Richards Library, because that was built in 1864. It continued as such until 1948, when it became the town library and still is. And I just wanted to say that I think that's the teacher, and she was Carrie Stevens, my great-great-aunt, which was a fun discovery. I didn't know that she'd actually taught in Georgetown, so. Okay, thanks.
So we know all the places in 1821 that weren't schools. We still don't know what places were schools, except for maybe a couple in 1821. But by 1841, as you can see here, there was a selectmen's report that listed in the report the 9 schools that were, or districts anyway, that were in Georgetown. And 1841 is, as Ginny alluded to earlier, is an important year because that's the year that Arousik incorporated and broke away from what had then been the combined Arousik-Georgetown community of Georgetown. And so we feel fairly confident that this represents the 9 that were districts. And the first one, the Northern District, or the Benjamin Riggs District, as Ginny mentioned earlier, there was an agent for each district. And our understanding is the agent lived in the district. So the good news about that is we're able to perhaps track even better than before where the districts were, because we can figure out where the person lived. So the Northern District was in Robin Hood. And one of the things that was both challenging and fun about this map is that I was using this little map on my computer and trying to put relatively small numbers, which is a little difficult. But the good news is, since I don't know exactly where the buildings were, it covers a wide swath of about 2 square miles. And so I'm sure they must be right for that reason. Number 2 is down here. That's the Back River School, which you saw a picture of that earlier, the Benjamin Emmons District in West Georgetown. The Lower Stone Schoolhouse, which is down here, which was the Joseph Barry District down on Bay Point. We're going to skip over number 4 for a minute, if we can, please. Then there's the Long Island District, which is number 5, also called the Ephraim Spinney District. Number 6, Robin Hood Cove, or the Jotham Trafton District in Georgetown Center, is number 6. Number 7, Harmon's Harbor, or the William Snowman District in Five Islands, which covers practically all the Five Islands with my number 7. So it's a safe bet there. Number 8 is the Little Good Harbor, or the Wood School, or the John Hinckley District. And then there was indeed a school on McMahon Island. So you had a school on McMahon Island, you had a school on Long Island, which tells you also a little bit more about schools being in places where there were students and where students could get access to education, because at this time we're talking about a population of roughly 1,000 or 1,100 people in Georgetown. And that's everyone, not just students, of course. Let's go back to number 4. This was a bit of a puzzle for us for a while. We have not been aware of a school. First of all, what school would be called the Southern or the Wadsworth Oliver district. I mean, when you look at some of these schools, there are quite a few what we would consider southern Georgetown schools. So with the help of Chester Horn, who did some research for us in census data from 18...
And I think sometimes this was quite challenging. Listed a few of the diseases that sometimes were problems in schools. There are several mentions in the records of, for example, there not being a winter term because there was so much illness about, or the fall term was cut short. There's definitely one from, I think it was the 1850s, where so many of the pupils had whooping cough that they simply closed the school for the remainder of the fall term. Students often attended somewhat irregularly, in part because of weather and also because they may have been needed for work at home if one of their parents happened to be ill or unable to work at the time. The other thing was funding was always an issue. The lack of funds for adequate books. There's a lot of talk in the 1890s reports about how fast the school books wear out. And actually, I don't think that's something, and they keep trying to say, well, if we make the parents responsible, will they have better care of them? I think that's actually a problem that has never gone away. Firewood was a cost. Repairs to the firewood and repairs, another costs, and so there were struggles about funding necessary not only necessary things that had to happen for students to be comfortable enough to focus on their schoolwork. And then the challenges for the students themselves. This sort of matches the irregular attendance one, but often the children really wanted to come to school and learn, but if they were needed at home for chores and work, sometimes they were kept back. Lengthy travel to school. There was definitely a tradition that shows up in many of the documents that students shouldn't have to walk for more than 30 minutes to get to school, but many of them definitely did. Shoes were a big expense for families, and a lot of times they actually went to school barefoot. But and of course their feet were perhaps hardened to do that, but it can't have been comfortable in certain cold weather and rain and so forth. And I've mentioned uncomfortable classrooms. Sometimes near the wood stove it would be really hot and then absolutely frigid at the back. And a lot of times the classrooms were pretty poorly lighted. I've mentioned weather and illness. Also there are stories about lighthouse keepers' children rowing to school from Perkins Island, children from Bay Point walking to school barefoot because they had to cross a shallow end of Robin Hood Cove, and there were stepping stones that they could step across, so they didn't actually have to wade, but there was a pretty good chance that in that process their feet would get wet. And they weren't supposed to get their shoes wet because, as I've mentioned, shoes were expensive. So there were some differences between our times.
A little bit about curriculum, just a little bit. This is a book that's in our archives, a very small, tiny little book called Instructions for Children Intended for the Use of the Methodist Societies. And I'm pretty sure you can't see it very well, but I point out here. It was published in 1814, and it was owned, that's an upside-down signature that says, signed Washington Heel, Georgetown, Maine. Washington Heel, the Heel family were located in the beautiful white farmhouse that's on 127. If you're coming from Bath, you go past the Robin Hood Road turn, which is on your left. You go past that, and a short ways after that, on your right is a big white house that's very close to the road, and there's a big sliding hill on the left, and that's the Heel house, and that belonged to that family, Washington Heel in particular. And what I find, and we find interesting about this, is that this is perhaps a very good example of where schools were at that period of time, which is, not surprisingly, much of the education came out of teaching children about the Bible and religion, and that was part of learning how to read. This one happens to be addressed specifically to all parents and schoolmasters. And so this clearly is an instruction booklet about how parents and schoolmasters can teach their children. This is sort of the religious or morally based education. An example of the writing, which would be tough to read, but it says, "I have laid before you in the following tract the true principles of the Christian education of children. These should, in all reason, be instilled into them as soon as ever they can distinguish good from evil. And why may they not be taught the knowledge of letters at the same time?"
What's translated from the French?
Well, I don't know. It says, "A great part of what follows is translated from the French, only it is here cast into another form and divided into sentences that I don't know if the French didn't use sentences. I don't quite understand that. That it may be the more easily be understood either by teachers or learners." I presume that this literally, it doesn't say much about it further in the text, but it was a translation from some kind of French source, evidently. And I have no idea what it means. Translated from the French. I have no idea.
Maybe.
Perhaps. Oh, that's a good, thank you. That's an
That's
interesting suggestion, observation.
What was that?
Rousseau, perhaps Rousseau. This is a school practice book from 1835, and Ginny and I were both quite taken by it, and it's a donation from Jeanne Reynolds to the Historical Society, and this is one of the pages. And first of all, I'm impressed with the handwriting. And what it also shows is a change in some of the content of learning. And now we're talking about the practical application of math and reading, and arithmetic, I should say, and reading, and direct application. Part of the translation, if you will, of the handwriting here is, oops, now it's my turn to do this. Is a tare is an allowance made to the buyer for the weight of the hogshead, barrel, or bag containing the commodity. Tret is an allowance for waste dust. Cloth is an allowance for the turn of the seal. What I find fascinating about that is that these words are still words that are familiar, and they do indeed, because I had never heard those terms before, and so I went to the dictionary, and sure enough, tare is an allowance made for the weight of the packaging in order to determine the new weight of the goods. I pay attention to that whenever I go to Bath Natural. I want to know how much my container weighs before they charge me for what's inside of it. Tret is an allowance of extra weight made to the purchaser to compensate for waste during transport, which makes sense if you're talking about having to ship things. Cloth, I couldn't find anywhere. That must be one of those words that sort of fell by the wayside, or perhaps I didn't know exactly what it was when I was trying to look it up. But if you look at the various math problems and so forth, you can see that education has changed. Here's another page. This is like if two trains leave the stations at the same time, one from such and such. What is the amount of a seaman's wages from and this is where it gets tough to translate, from the 15th of June to the 28th of May, following at 15, I think it's dollars per month. And then down below, what will 19.5 tons 27 come to at 19 pounds, I guess, or
Shillings.
shillings. Yeah, shillings. 19 cents, 11 3/4 shillings. That's shillings.
Shilling,
Okay, so
19.
pounds and shillings, and pence or something. Anyway, per ton. And then there's this comment at the bottom. This is a hard sum. And so once again, we're doing math. We're doing business school. We're doing lots of things, which is very different in education at this point.
And here we have we have a few pictures of teachers and classes. Does anyone know what school this is? This was not in our previous slides.
next to the Five Islands Church.
Yes, Frank, you got it. It's the former gum factory. And that became a school, and the building is still standing next to the church in Five Islands. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this picture is that there is a comment in one of the school reports about it's sometimes difficult to teach a class that has a large number of very small children in it. And this could have been one such class, because if you look at the first row, they are pretty little, except maybe for the girl in the pinafore. But see, these are...
And the bare feet.
And the bare feet. So that, anyway, I think that's possible. This was, we didn't have an exact date for this, but we're thinking the late 1880s, 1890s perhaps. This one is from the Bay Point Old Stone Schoolhouse in circa 1890. The teacher is Howard Trafton there in the bowler hat. And in this one, you can see that some of the students in the back seem well into their teens. So, it's an example of the variation in age. And as I mentioned, it could be anywhere from 6 to 21. The next one is the Riggsville School up in current Robin Hood. The teacher in the school is Oscar Williams. They're in the middle. And the last names of some of the students are Maines, Jewett, Eaton, Colby, Beals, Campbell, McMahon, Lagarde, Heel, and White. So these are certainly names of the old families that we're familiar with. Now we have the Red Brick School in Georgetown Center. The date of this photo is unknown. And if there's somebody who's good with fashion, especially hats, this is the hat picture. And I particularly like the hat on the school teacher in the doorway there. That may be a way that we can get closer to the date. I'm sure it's the 1890s, but I don't know exactly which year.
They've all got shoes on.
But this class all had shoes. And hats. Both feet and heads covered. Now we move up to quite a lot more contemporary one. This is the Five Islands School in 1947. And this is held in the building that's now the substation for the Five Islands. And the student names that are in this picture include Hannah, Cunningham, Moore, Clark, Stevens, Thibodeau, Dutton, McMahon, McGilvery, Pinkham, Campbell, Gray, Riddle, Davis, Carr, and the teacher was Mrs. Mary Whitmore. So that brings us up closer to when the central school was formed.
Right.
Is this multiple grades?
Yes.
Yes, yes, and also heated by a wood stove that the older boys came a half hour early to stoke in the mornings.
Mrs. Whittemore was later teaching in Fitchburg.
Was she?
Was she? Ah.
Well, once again, showing the ongoing relationship between the peninsulas and the islands in this area. We often joke about how long it takes, to get, let's say, from the southern end of Georgetown down to Popham Beach. But lots of people would just go from West Georgetown across to Long or whatever, and would cross by water. And over the years, we've heard many a story about how many people went from Five Islands over to Southport for a dance. So traveling for teachers was nothing unusual as well. This is someone that we thought we should just mention to you folks, and the Pinkhams know this gentleman quite well, this being Frank's great uncle. Stin Davis is perhaps an amazing example of strength and character and fortitude. And I won't get into his wonderful long story, but there was a publication done a few years back, probably 15, 20 years ago now, about the elders, and he was chosen as one of the people to interview and highlight, and there's a wonderful publication that we have at the Historical Society. But Captain Stinn, as he was known, had quite a long life and an interesting life. He was born in Georgetown, was at sea much of his life. Then when he came back at his wife's insistence, finally, to not be at sea anymore, they lived in New Hampshire for a while, but eventually came back to Georgetown. And while he was interviewed, he talked about when he went to school. He said, I went to school, I guess, until I was 14. And I went to school when I was 5 years old. I had dresses. Little kids 4 or 5 years old, boys, wore dresses. We waded to school. The older boys used to get to the schoolhouse early and build the fires and have it warm for the little kids. Stinn Davis grew up in what's now Seguinland Road, or a lot of people know it as the Park Road. And we understand that at some point he actually went to school in the house where he grew up for some period of time, but mostly he went to school at the old stone schoolhouse, which you can see on your way to Reed State Park. I guess you would say he's sort of the quintessential Mainer who, having lived a long 103 years, had lots of stories to tell, and an amazing life of nearly drowning a couple of times, losing a brother at sea, and happening to come back on his own ship coming north from North Carolina and seeing the wreckage of what he later found out was his brother's boat where he drowned. And so quite a remarkable life. But all his successes, I think, no doubt, due to a fine education in Georgetown, Maine. He went on to great success, and a lot of common sense also taught in Georgetown. This is the final, we presume, centralization of the many districts of Georgetown. The new Georgetown Central School, which opened in the fall of 1947. And it was truly an amazing commitment by a community to build a central school that was modern and available. There was a school bus to all the kids of Georgetown. And our understanding is that the Georgetown School was one of the very first coastal schools, coastal communities that sought and received some assistance from the state of Maine to help build this building. And so I think that also shows the commitment that the people of Georgetown had to education. Now, we were scheduled a couple of special guests today, and one person was going to be here, but she was unable to be here at the last minute, and we want to thank her for trying but unable to come. Joanne, Hagen, Atwood was going to be with us today to tell a couple of stories, but she couldn't be here. But this tells you a little bit about something about Joanne and also about Georgetown schools. Joanne was one of the handful of students who was a graduate of the new Georgetown Central School, which was up through grade 6 at the time. And she was the valedictorian, as you can see by the commencement exercises, along with a few other people that you might recognize some familiar names on that list. It was a pretty proud moment, from what I understand, for the people of Georgetown to have their own graduating class from their central school.
So now I would like to introduce Jeanne Reynolds, who's familiar to many of you from giving programs here before. He's going to tell us a few stories from his time in Georgetown schools in the 1940s. A couple of things about Jeanne. Not only is he a wonderful storyteller, but both an avid and generous member of Georgetown Historical Society since it was formed. And relating to this program, he attributes his love of history to having 3 aunts who were school teachers. So, Jeanne.
think we're running out of time.
No, we have plenty of time.
We've got time.
We've got time.
When I was about 5 years old, we looked forward to going into grammar school. And when I turned 6, we all, me and quite a few cousins, were all prepared. Our mothers had taught us a lot before we went to school. Anyway, one of my aunts had a daughter who was a year younger than us, and she went to our parents, and it was me and a Lasky boy, he was Paula's family, and one other boy in town who were eventually ended up graduating from Moss with this aunt's daughter at the same time. And the mothers held us all back one year. Can you imagine doing that today? I graduated at 19, Clayton Heel graduated at 19. Everybody wondered why we were so damn old. But it helped in sports and it helped in studies too. When we got in school, my first school was the brick schoolhouse in Georgetown Center. And my bus got to, there were buses, we didn't have to walk. The first crew there still had to light the fire in the stove and warm the building up. Noon times, we were given an hour's recess, which was too long, because I remember going all across the peninsula and playing in the caves on the river on the other side of the school. Once floating, playing on ice cakes out front of the building, I fell in the water at noontime, and I had whistle breeches on, you know, corduroy breeches, and soaking wet up to my belt. I got out all right, but I was pretty uncomfortable the rest of the day. Now, we had a teacher in grammar school that came down from northern Maine, and she actually stayed at my present house for 3 or 4 years, but she pounded into all of our classes at that time, you're not going to quit school at 8th grade. The school, during World War II, we had 40-some kids in one room with one teacher. And you did learn from the upper grades a lot, but it was pretty crowded. This particular teacher did get it through to most of the class. I think there was about 15 in the class that graduated, and I know a dozen of them went to Moss, and most of them graduated from high school. That was, whereas earlier, one person every 4 or 5 years would go to high school. The worst days were when you got there early in the morning, there was no kindling. One day I took all the switches that the teacher, Miss Hardy, I took all the switches she had and used them as kindling to start the fire. And when the teacher came, one girl, happened to be my cousin, who we stayed back a whole darn year for. She said, well, Jeanne broke up all your switches. Well, she made her go sit in the corner for a few hours. I think during World War II, there were some exciting days, because I've told this story before. Airplanes from the Brunswick Naval Air Station came out, flew up over Dresden and down to Georgetown Island. They flew right down the river, the cove, Robin Hood Cove, right over the schoolhouse to Reed State Park Beach. They had cut a swath of trees about probably 100 foot wide for the directional signal for them to fly down over the beach at Reed. And there were targets on the beach and floating off the Reed Park, down near Todd's Point. They dropped bombs. They were firing machine guns all day. This was in 1942 through 45, the end of the war. We saw one plane crash The teacher at that time was a man named Taylor. He sweat all the time. Every winter or summer, he sweat. Maybe with 40 kids teaching, you would. He would quit teaching at about 2:30 and go into bath because he worked nights in the yard and leave us alone for an hour, hour and a half. Do that today? We behave ourselves pretty good. And one night, one afternoon, we were standing outside the school. But then the schools had split, and 5 Islands kids came over to join us. That's where I met my wife for the first time. We all had about hour and a half to wait for the bus, and at that particular day, it was January in the middle 40s, a plane came over the school and it was on fire, smoke coming out of the engine. 2 boys in it, machine gun sticking out the second man's cockpit, and they turned toward Brunswick, probably trying to get back to the naval base. They failed. It went over the hill behind Walter Powers' house and crashed in West Georgetown. I've probably told this story too many times, but a bunch of us walked and ran all the way over to West Georgetown and got there just after the Georgetown 5 Islands Fire Department had got the flames put out. Both boys were killed in the plane. Canvases covered them on the ground. Wing broke off up in the woods, and the engines in January had driven a foot or two into the ground. The fire was out, and one man in a truck come along and says, "What the H are you kids doing here?" And he made us get in the back of his truck, and we rode out with him. Later on, we found there was a .50 caliber machine gun in the truck, and it was sold to someone later on. I think that the years spent at Georgetown were well worth it. Mrs. Joanne Hagen, for instance, she was, I think, the first Georgetown person to be valedictorian of her class, too. My sister was in that class. The little brochures down here were something that teachers bought probably for a nickel apiece, and some of them had photographs tipped in on the top. 2 pages. They used them as celebration, Christmas, graduations. I want to pass them around. Sure. The idea, I never found any of Bath. I wished I could. Maybe you folks have got some in your collections. I think I don't know. I got one more story. Let's see what I got.
Sure, one more story, Jean.
No, I probably better close. We're near the end.
Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks so much. We close with a slide of Edith Barry Horn at the Old Stone Schoolhouse, circa 1975, when the Georgetown Historical Society was established. So now I'd like to say, school's out.